have a few administrative announcements to make before we start off the procedure for today. Tomorrow, which is 16th May, at the same time, 3 p.m., we have a seminar where Johan Kawowski is going to present on Joseph Broad, Tito, and Jawaharlal Nehru from distant countries to close satellites. It's a very interesting work because Johan has worked both in China, in India, as well as in Yugoslavia, which is where he is from. So it's a very interesting sort of work in progress. Then on Tuesday, 21st of May, we have a weekly seminar by Professor Uday Kumar, who is a senior fellow here, on petitionist historiography, Dr. Palku and Kerala's past. On 22nd May, which is Wednesday, we have a public lecture in the series Science, Society and Nature by Professor Vishwajit Pandya, who will be speaking on In Terra Nullius, the legacies of science and colonialism in Andaman Islands. And on Friday, 24th May, 2013, we have a workshop on ecology and society, which is led by Dr. Rohan D'Souza of Jawaharlal Nehru University, with a number of other scholars who will be participating. All of these details are also available on the Memorial Museum and Library website, so please do mark in the calendar. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Devanathan today to speak. He is a professor at the Institute of Human Development here in New Delhi and is also a visiting research fellow at Duke University in the United States. Professor Devanathan is also an honorary professor at the Institute of Ethnology, Yunnan Academy of Social Sciences in Kunming in China. His research interests include labor conditions in global development and development issues of indigenous people. Some of his most recent publications are Profit, Trends and Wages in Global Production Networks, which was published in EPW recently, and there's Markets and Indigenous Peoples in Asia, which is brought out by the Oxford University Press. At the moment, he's coordinating a large sort of multi-institution collaborative project called Promoting Inclusive Growth in South Asia. Professor Devanathan will be talking to us today about the future of India, the middle income trap, and innovation in the world economy. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I must thank Professor Murthy, the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and the Director for inviting me to give this lecture here. I was a fellow here some many years ago, almost 2 decades ago. So it's good to come back here to this room where we used to hold our weekly seminars in that period. All of this looks very similar and familiar to as it used to be in those days. In this, the topic, as the title of the topic of the lecture which I've chosen is The Future of India. I'm not trying to say that what exactly will be, etc., but what I want to take up is issues which will become important over some time. We have a number of immediate issues which we have to tackle, which are there in the economy, which I think you all know about: current account deficit, fiscal deficit, etc. And surely we have to get over that cliff if we need to get back to something better than it has been in the last 2-3 years. There are other medium-term and even longer-term issues which we have to deal with, of a very low human development index compared to our per capita income. India is in that unfortunate category of having an HDI lower than its income should predict. And we still have very high levels of non-access to sanitation and drinking water and health services, etc. These are all issues which are there before us and which we surely have to tackle. But I want to take up more the longer-term issues in terms of how do we go from where we are to where we might be. This links up with 2 types of problems which really come together. One is the whole discussion which has been going on about the Asian century. That if the 19th century was the British century and the 20th century the American century, that this 21st century will be the Asian century. It might well be, but I want to take the question that what is needed if there is to be an Asian century? I don't think it's something that's foreordained or will happen by itself. It's something needs to be done if there is to be an Asian century. So that's one of the questions I will deal with in the context of India, and of course we have to bring in China, which is much more a bigger player in this likely Asian century. The second issue, more restricted but linked to it, is this question of what we call in economics, we call it the middle income trap. That many countries reach that middle income level but don't go beyond it. The Latin American countries are the best example of this, and in fact the whole term and the discussion of middle income trap came up around the Latin American discussion. What happened? Why didn't they go beyond where they were in the 1960s and 70s when they had reached the limits of the technological frontier that existed? Why have they stagnated at that level and not gone beyond it? Now, in my mind, these two questions are linked. The middle income trap, getting out of the middle income trap, and whether there will be an Asian century, the two are linked. If we are able to get out of it, certain things are needed, and those are the same things that are needed if there is to be an Asian century. So I have linked these two topics, these two questions together. It really is one issue that is with regard to the question of innovation and the world economy. So that's why I'd like to concentrate on what I think is needed for the future. Maybe we're still doing a lot of it already, but it's something that's going to become more and more important as we go ahead. So just to introduce the question of the middle income, of the Asian century. First is that, China and India are together already 20% of world GDP, which is very different from what it was in 1950, where it was hardly 3 to 4% of world GDP, even surely less than 5% altogether. But it is more or less, it's still lower than, say, it was 200 years ago, when China and India together, and Brazil, if we take the three, were perhaps almost 50% of the world's GDP. But there are people who do these very careful calculations. It's very difficult to do this, but there's Angus Madison, who spent his whole life trying to put together statistics on the world economy, and you can go right back to the year zero, to the birth of Christ, and you can say what was the structure of the world, how was it distributed at that time. So anyway, so this is why people like André Gaulle-Frank, when they wrote about this, he wrote a book called Reorienting the World. Orienting very deliberately used, that we're going back to what used to be the center of the world, which was the Orient. So anyway, but we are back to a situation which is much better, which is like 20%, and the change in the world balance of power is already being felt even in the current world crisis, when the BRICS together, you will be familiar with the BRICS, together accounts for more than 50% of world growth is coming from the BRICS. So therefore, you can't deal with the current world recession if you don't bring the BRICS into the equation. Therefore, rather than having the G7 or the G8 to deliberate about what measures to be taken, or just leaving it to the IMF, which is dominated by this G7, they had to bring into the discussion the G20, which includes all of these BRICS and a few more countries which are not part of that. So, but the point is that while their role is increasing, the question of the Asian century or any of that type of century depends really not just on size, but on key technology areas. Those particularly who dominate the multi-purpose or generic technology. I mean, the British century was built on steam as the main form of power, railways, and factory production. Factory production being the form of organization of production. The 20th century, the USA was built on electricity, the internal combustion engine, and mass production. The Ford factory, which began the system of mass production in the early 20th century. So, what will be the technology of this future, of this century, and which will be the key technology which whoever dominates that technology will surely lead the world. This is the simple proposition that I would like to make. That it is the key technological domination which results in leading the world. Dominating the world, etc., that's another thing. But at least if you want to establish world leadership, you have to be the leader in the key technology of that era. Now, technology is not an exogenous variable. It's not something that comes from outside the economic system. It surely is produced within the system. It is an endogenous variable, but the question, I'm not going to say how it is created, that's another type of issue, but I just want to lay stress on why it is important to pay attention to the creation of technology and not just its use. Now, looking at this technological development, there is a way of looking at it which uses the analysis for what's called long waves that there are in history, at least in the history of capitalism. Surely if we go backwards, we'll find it even in earlier history. There are long waves of history which are characterized by a certain kind of technology. For instance, in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, you had mechanization and water power, and then you got the time of the steam and the railways. Then after that you got steel, electricity, and heavy engineering. So you have in each period of progressive, the Russian economists thought that there were long waves about 40 to 50 years, but we may not have exactly that kind of 40 to 50 years, or if there is such a thing, it's just a pure, just simply a curiosity why it has that period. But surely we do have long waves which have been analyzed, and it was Capita who built on that, and now there's an economist, Carlos Perez from Venezuela, who also has been developing the theory of these long waves. Now, in the current situation, or if we go to I'll just characterize three areas. The first Industrial Revolution, starting with mechanization, then going on to steam and railways. The second Industrial Revolution, which was oil, the internal combustion engine, and mass production. And now we are at a new inflection point. I think every crisis signals a change in some direction. Something happens, and that's why there's a crisis. I'll come back to that later. But it is clearly an inflection point where something is going to change in the economy. We've reached the limits of one kind of accumulation, and you get a crisis. You've reached the limits of productive accumulation, and you move to what's called financialization. More and more investment in financial assets rather than in new production. And that itself is the factor that leads to a crisis, which is as we see right now. So we are in a new crisis situation, which is an inflection point. What are the two technologies which are coming up now and which will be crucial in the coming period, maybe the whole of this century? One clearly is the ICT revolution, which started earlier but continues. It has still not played itself out. It hasn't reached the limits of what it could do to transform various areas of production. The other is the rise of the renewable energy requirement. So we are shifting away from the fossil fuel regime, which characterized most of the 20th century. Before that, it was not a fossil fuel system. It is with the internal combustion engine that we really got the fossil fuel coming out. But we are now moving to a situation where we have to move away from fossil fuel and to some form of renewable energy, which has to be used for electricity or as therefore a key generic technology in the current period. So in a technological sense, what I would say is that the current economic crisis shows two things. The exhaustion of accumulation in the core, what has been so far the core, but it's very quickly ceasing to be, the Atlantic and the Japanese economy, that is based on the exhaustion of that particular type of accumulation, and that other countries are also beginning to face the limits of catch-up industrialization. The Latin American countries reached that some time ago. China is reaching it now, and perhaps India too doesn't have very far to go. We still have some distance to go. So the possibilities still remain that if we have the right kind of policies, we can take advantage of what's called the demographic, we can take use of the demographic advantage. If we have the right policies and the factory Asia kind of development can continue with India and South Asia beginning to play a bigger role than it has so far. But there still is very clearly some kind of limits, and that's why you not only see a crisis in the West and Japan, but you also see a slowing down of the rest of the world. I mean, China and India have both dropped 2 to 3 percentage points from their trend rates of growth in the last 10 years, and now clearly there's something different. So we're going to have to require some changes. Something new has to be done if there is to be a movement beyond the position that we are in now. Now, just to summarize briefly, what is this middle income position that I'm talking about? India, of course, is very much a lower middle income country. Even in now, it still has a PPP, purchasing power parity per capita income, of about $3,600 per year per person, which is higher than it used, much higher than it used to be, but still China is about 2.5 times that at about $8,400 per year per person. while Brazil is at $11,400 per year per person. And Brazil is the quintessential middle-income country. So around 11 to 12,000 is really that middle income, the limit of the middle income area, and which is the problem that I'm talking about. Of course, the population is being so large in China and India, the weight in the economy is far beyond their per capita income. So China's economy is something like $11 trillion, but this again in per capita, in PPP terms, while India's is about $4.5 trillion, while Brazil is $2.25 trillion. So their per capita income is much higher with a very small population compared to India and China. Their role in the world economy becomes much less because that depends on your size and not just on per capita income. So what do we need to get out of this? So the question I can put in this way, so what do you do after you've caught up? By catch up, what happens? You reach the frontier of the technology that's possible. You reach the technological frontier. Your production has now adopted the latest available techniques, technologies available. So after that, if you don't move beyond it, you will stagnate because productivity cannot increase any further. So you have got the best types of your production. So that's where the stagnation comes in. If you then reach that point where productivity does not increase anymore, you no longer can you can't increase output you can't increase per capita income by increasing the amount of capital because you reach the limit of that frontier, and therefore you have to have something else. And this is where the question of innovation comes in. That's why I'd like to stress that innovation is what is important in breaking out of the middle income trap. Now, and this is exactly where our Latin American countries have very substantially failed. They haven't been able to really make that break in the different areas of production in which they're involved. They haven't really come up with new products or different types of ways of doing things. They've come up with some innovations, but not in that manner as would make a difference to their per capita income. Now, what are these innovations? I'll just go briefly to the different types of innovation. One is what we may call a process innovation. You make the same thing, but make it in a different way. India has done two very important process innovations, which have been what the business economist Christensen calls the very disruptive innovations. They have disrupted the market. India's first disruptive innovation was the development of generic drug production. And it really has completely disrupted the world market. The big pharmaceutical companies can no longer sell at the prices at which they used to sell. The price of the retroviral drugs that are used for AIDS came down like a factor by almost 100 when the Indian companies were able to push this, and then they got support from the WHO that requires, that it's an essential drug, you cannot stop its production, and you cannot stop its sale by India to the African countries. So it disrupted the world market to the extent that India now produces 1/4 of all the drugs that are sold in the USA and Europe. They come from India. As these countries are trying to cheapen their costs of medical service, because it's a huge cost. In the USA, 15% of GDP is on medical service. So they have to cheapen the cost if they want to get out of their fiscal problems. So they have to turn to Indian drugs, which are generic drugs, and India now accounts for 1/4 of the drugs sold in those markets. The other one, which is also a process innovation, is what India did in the IT services segment. The Indian companies perfected what is known now as the global delivery model. That is, you combine very expensive onshore, highly paid onshore units in the USA or Europe, along with offshore units set up in India, which of course cost much less. You divided the work between these two, and you put together a product which cost much less than it did to do it only onshore. Besides, they were also able to utilize time difference and, as I say, follow the sun. So they could very quickly deliver the service that was required. When the offices in the US closed down, the offices in India started working, and by the time the US offices got back to work, India had done whatever calculations and basic work required and could send it back to them. So in this way, they speeded up the delivery of services and very considerably cheapened the delivery of offshore services to the extent that, India now accounts for almost 50% of the world exports of offshore services, not total offshore, not total services, IT services, but of the exported offshore services, India accounts for about 50% of that. Now, the disruption was, again, it disrupted the world market because the big companies like IBM and Accenture, they then had to do the same thing as the Indian companies did. They were stuck at the high end and they had very costly services. But they also had to come to India, set up their units in India, employ. Now IBM is a larger employer in India than any of the Indian firms because they have such a large unit here. So they also combine this onshore-offshore system and they are able to provide that end-to-end service. So these were two very disruptive innovations. They were process innovations, but the problem with the process innovation is that it can be copied. You can't patent it. You can't have a patent on a business model like you can on a drug or a product. So anybody can copy it, and therefore the margins after a time will come down as competition increases. So therefore, if you now look at the press papers nowadays, you will see that the Indian IT companies are in a bit of a crisis. They surely face a problem of middle age. We should remember that TCS is a very old company, but Infosys was formed 30 years ago. So it's not such a young company anymore. It's a middle-aged company. And it has surely reached the level of middle age. And how to now get out of this is exactly the problem they're facing. And they're trying to do it in two ways. They're trying to move to the high end so that they only don't do the middle to the lower, which they were doing so far, because that's where the margins have fallen. They're also trying to move into products. You see, the advantage of a product is that you can sell and resell it again and again. I mean, Windows is a product. The software we all use in our PCs is a product. And Microsoft can sell 10 million of those. So it's not just one service, it's a product. So you can sell it a number of times. So TCS, and both mainly Infosys, is moving into products. But products are very difficult. They're not easy to manage. And they require a different way of marketing. They require different skills to develop them. So they are facing a crisis. But they are trying to get out of it by changing their business strategy. Okay. So we come to the second kind of innovation. That is product innovation. Now, product innovations themselves can be generally of two kinds. One, we think of it as a new product altogether, something that didn't exist before this, like the VCR. When the VCR came out, there was nothing like the VCR before that, which could record something of that type. Or when the TV came out, it was a new product. There wasn't a TV before the TV started, before it was true. So that was a new product. But then you also have incremental changes in a well-established product. So you now have high-definition TV, which is an incremental development over the regular TV. You have different kinds of things which come up, which are not new products, but which are not how to put it, basic innovations, basic inventions, but are incremental changes, but they can also yield high return. The third type of thing within the product, which is where the importance is that you can have new generic or multi-purpose technology. Generic technology is that which can be used in a number of sectors, not just within a particular area alone. The energy system is obviously a generic technology because electricity as a form of energy is used everywhere. Or ICT is a generic technology because IT can be used in any field, including, say, over here in our research, or in communication, or in running a railway system. IT can be used in anything. So it's a generic technology. So the generic or multi-purpose technologies have a different role and therefore will have a much bigger impact. Now you can also have innovations in providing public goods, which often is not looked upon as very important, but really is very, very crucial. For instance, our UID system, the unique identity, the Aadhaar which we are all now getting. This is a very major innovation in the world. For the first time, you have a biometric system of identification, which uses not just one fingerprint, but uses 10 fingerprints, 2 iris measurements, has 3 computer systems running it. So the possibility of a duplicate getting through is very, very, very low. Once we complete the 1.2 billion likely persons who can get an Aadhaar card, there may be just something like 400,000 duplicates, which is very, very, very low given this. So we have not had before a system like this. So this is a leapfrogging, but it's for public good provision. It's not a private good. But of course, on the Aadhaar system, you can now build a number of applications. Aadhaar is only a platform. It is an identity platform. On that, you can have a banking application. You can have a health insurance application. You can check who all are going to school or not going to school. You can check who have been children have been immunized or not immunized. All of these things can be done. And of course, you can do the other very important thing, which is to remove duplicates and fake persons who don't exist, which has plagued all of our delivery systems of public services. You can have ghost ration cards, you can have duplicate ration cards, and all of these, even the Narega, you can have ghosts being enrolled on them and the money being rationed off. The same person can take money in a number of places, but these things you can't do with the UID. That's eliminated. Even with the smart card, you can still have you can't have a ghost because you must have some fingerprint or something to have with a smart card. But you can have duplicates. You can have a smart card in one village and another smart card in your mother's village and another smart card in your grandfather's village. So you can't eliminate that. But with the UID, because once it gets into the cloud, into that internet space where these are there, they're all checked and there will be a matching done. You can authenticate. First of all, you can authenticate is A or somebody else. Secondly, is there only one A in the whole system? That also can be done. That's the importance of it. And it's a novel use of a technology. The technology itself is not so new because, Facebook and all run on the same kind of technology, what they call big data analytics. You have billions of data points. If you have 1.2 billion people in India, when it is finished, you will have 120 billion fingerprints. Fingerprints per person. That's a huge amount of data. So that's the point, that this is a very major innovation when you have done the biometrics, which was used initially mainly for forensic purposes. Fingerprints have been used for a long time in police work. Then they were used for surveillance work, which everybody who goes to the USA has to be fingerprinted. So they're checking to see who you are before they let you in. So that's surveillance. But now it is being used for an identity for development purposes. So this is a very major leapfrogging technology which allows a country that was not at the frontier of that technology to go and become a new frontier point in that technology. Similarly, there can be another kind of public good technology which will surely come up, which is there, and that is the question of the mass transport. Because we are already coming to a point where clearly the old techno-economic paradigm of individualized transport surely cannot hold. You had around Beijing, last year there was a traffic jam which was 150 kilometers long and took 3 weeks to clear. Now, you can't continue with a system like this. Okay. And I remember our driver saying, what will happen to Delhi in 5 years' time? We come from Gurgaon, we used to travel every day. They think, what will happen to Delhi? With all these flyovers and all, in 5 years' time, they will be overwhelmed by the number of cars there are on this road. So we already have a metro, and therefore that's a good thing, we can move in that direction. But surely there has to be some shift in the manner of people being transported within the big metropolitan centers in the world. Okay. So now then the question, given that this is the problem that we face, that we have to move from the catching up, which is using technology, to innovation, which is a manner of creating technology. What is the way in which this can be done? Now, in economics, or even as we look at the history of the capitalist world, we have a standard model of technology development. That technology is developed in the West, in the high-income countries, and then you kind of dumb it down or pare it down, make a minimal version of it for the low-income countries. So, and then we as low-income countries, we carry out what's called reverse engineering. We try to copy it and make the product ourselves. For instance, whoever designed a table, the first person to design a table, somebody else saw that a table works in certain ways and then also made it. So it was a reverse engineering, okay. That you see that's how a product works, it has a certain effect, and you copy it. So this is what we did in drugs. That we know that the drug, that statin was to reduce your, the cholesterol level. So then our companies went, now that discovery was not done by the Indian company, that the statin was to reduce the cholesterol level. But then once it was known that a statin has that impact, then our companies went around and they were able to copy it and make it in a different way, even in a cheaper way. And of course at that time, unfortunately, we did not have product patents, we only had process patents. So they were able to get around the patent system and make another process for manufacturing the same drug, and therefore they were able to come up with this system of the generic drugs with a slightly different molecule. So this was a system of reverse engineering which every country has gone through, except of course the first industrial country, which was England. Because then everybody else reverse engineered what they started with, whether it was the loom or everything else, and they started reverse engineering. So whenever a new product comes out, others quickly do a reverse engineering to find out how to make that same thing. Now, this is what we have done so far, but this is also now being, there's a new kind of engineering model which is coming up, which is being called frugal engineering. This is a term that was used first by Carlos Ghosn, who is the CEO of Renault Nissan, and he's of Brazilian origin. And when he came to India, he used this term, frugal engineering, to characterize the type of engineering which he saw over here in India. What is this frugal engineering? It means trying to do more with less, in a very modernistic manner, in almost in an artistic fashion, that less is more, that you don't have excesses, like you don't have a gold plating, like many products in the West are gold plated. That means you add on a layer of gold which doesn't add anything to its function. So in fact you bring it down, and the basic thing about frugal engineering is that you reduce the materials and the energy that are required, and instead increase the knowledge content. So you have more knowledge in the product. Usually we think of products as being the result of materials and energy with labor. But the point is knowledge. Without that knowledge, what do you do with that materials and that energy? And if you increase the knowledge content, maybe you can do less with the materials and the energy. For instance, to give an example of this frugally engineered product, there is the ATM that IIT Chennai developed, and which is now being sold and marketed around the world, particularly in Africa. They developed what they call a rural ATM. The rural economy has the first characteristic that a rural ATM would not have a very high volume of service. The number of customers likely to come to a rural ATM much less than, say, to an ATM in a city, obviously. So it must be profitable at even low volume. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's very dusty, and in India, very often rural areas don't have electricity. Even if they do, they have long periods when they don't have electricity. So you have to reduce the energy requirement, particularly to eliminate air conditioning. Now, all our ATMs, which we now have, require air conditioning because they produce so much heat that without that air conditioning, they would break down and not be serviceable. So what did the IIT engineers did was that they changed the entire operational system of the ATM. Our ATM machines have what's called a spring loading mechanism. The notes are loaded, very energy using, a spring system. They had a very simple way of going around it. They used a gravity system, which doesn't require energy. It just drops. So they were able to reduce the energy required to 5% of the original amount. So it doesn't require air conditioning. You can have an inverter and it can work even when the power fails. And this is very good for a rural market. So it is now being sold not only in India, State Bank has started installing them in some areas, it's also being sold in Africa. Now what is the importance of this kind of product? That it is a product that is meant for a low income market. It's not meant for a high income market. There are products of the same type which you will have in both markets. For instance, the smartphone. I'm sure almost everybody here has a smartphone. Yes? I'm sure there is nobody here without a smartphone in this room. Not even. That would be very surprising. You can't see your email on your phone?
No.
Okay, that's interesting. I'm sure you may be the only person here. That is okay. Okay, that's very surprising. Nowadays, almost everyone has a smartphone. Even the youngsters in the villages, they also own smartphones. So the point is there are two kinds of smartphones. There's the high-level smartphone, the iPhone, the Apple iPhone, which will cost you $400 to $600 a piece, and the BlackBerry, these are the high-level smartphones, and then there's the bottom of the pyramid smartphone, okay, which costs now, Nokia has come out with one which will only cost 4,000 or 5,000 rupees, smartphone. 1900? Okay, so that's like 4,000 to 5,000 rupees. So now that market is obviously high volume, low price, and therefore low margin, low return, but very high volume. So the shift is there from high-end products to low-end products to these frugally engineered products which keep the essential requirements but remove all these superfluous, all those millions of other things which we never use. I mean, you have car systems which have so many functions which you can't even make out what they do. Now, actually, Capita is working with the German company that makes these functions, that whole infotainment system you have in the car, to pare it down, to bring it down to what's needed, not have 200 functions which you can't even know about, but just have the basic things, a GPS system, a music system, a news system, a control system for the car, etc. So these are the frugally engineered, where you reduce the amount by bringing it down to requirements, increase the knowledge content. As it is the Apple phone, for instance, which costs $600, the hardware itself is only $200, out of which, of course, only $10 goes to China, where it is assembled. The rest is the part. But $400 or $600 is due to its software and the royalties and the rents that Apple gets from making it. Now, so you can increase what you're saying is an increase, if we put it like this, an increase in the software and a reduction in the hardware content of every product. The software content of cars is now so high. There is a new car designed by Chevrolet, which, I forget the name of that car, which has more lines of code, computer code, than a Boeing 787 has. So you can imagine how much of it has been put into that. Now it's very easy to reproduce lines of code rather than material parts. So therefore it brings down the cost, and you have this system of frugal engineering to meet the low-end market. You may have heard of this famous phrase by the Indian business teacher, Prahlad, who used the phrase bottom of the market, bottom of the pyramid market. Okay, bottom of the pyramid. Now that bottom of the pyramid has been outside of consumption or of commercial production for a long time. But actually Indian companies also very smartly reached that bottom of the pyramid when they came out with these sachet shampoos and these very tiny little things of whitening creams and all of these things. They were able to reach that bottom of the pyramid who could not afford a whole tube of shampoo, but could afford a one-time use of shampoo which could be shared in the family. So designing products for that bottom of the pyramid, the high volume but low value market, which is a large part of the world market. Now, then the question, okay, who can do this? Do we in India, or Indian firms, do they have a particular advantage in doing this? Or Chinese firms? Or is it anybody who can do it? Now, Indian or companies located in India may perhaps have an advantage because a lot of the innovation has to link with the consumer use. You have to interact with consumers before you can really make a product. We usually, in the standard model again of innovation, it just is a scientist or an engineer sitting somewhere and making something, but that's not correct. A lot of it has to do with the user, the consumer. What is nowadays also being called the lead consumer. The lead consumers are often the ones who innovate something. They come up with new things. They're not a firm trying to set up a business. For instance, the Facebook. How did Facebook come about? there was this bunch of Harvard students who were trying to figure out how do we know who is available for a date and who is not available for a date, who is a good match, who is the kind of person I might like to date or I might not like to date. And so they came up with this software program, which is now Facebook. Now, they were not there in the business of making money. They are exactly what you call a lead consumer trying to solve a problem they have. How do we know who can date who on this Harvard campus? And then it has become what we now call Facebook in the world. These are lead consumers. They are not the innovators which we otherwise usually think of as a firm. This is not they made a firm out of it. They made one of the big firms in the world out of that innovation. But they didn't start out as a firm. They didn't even start out like Bill Gates did. Bill Gates had a very clear idea that I want to make this software to run a PC and to make a business out of it. They simply started to solve their own problems of dating. So these are the lead consumers who are very important. Now obviously a firm placed in India will be able to interact much better with low-end consumers than a firm based in say a high income market. That's why GEC also is very clear, and the chairman of the CEO of GEC, Imel, he's the one who wrote this paper along with Govind Rajan and others on reverse innovation, saying that now the model of innovation is changing. Rather than go from up to down, from innovating down from high income to low income countries, now we are moving into a situation of innovating up from low income to high income countries. We have to produce products which are suitable for this low-end market, but then finally they become important even for the high-end market. So in India, they developed the the handheld ECG. Why did they do that? Because they found that, look, in small hospitals, in district towns, in smaller towns, the hospitals or the clinics cannot afford a full-fledged ECG machine. So they devised a handheld ECG, which will be much cheaper. In China, similarly, they came up with a low-cost ultrasound machine with most of the requirements of the processing being put onto a PC, which can have multiple uses. And so they have now, GE itself came out with products that compete with its own high-end products. But these are now going back to the US, because under Obama, as they are trying to reduce the cost of healthcare, they want the cheap ECG and the cheap the ultrasound machine. So the low cost or the low market end innovation doesn't remain confined to that end of the market. It does go back and go up to the high end market. That's why this is being called innovating up from low to the high income economy. Now, for all of this to happen, of course, you need a very strong national innovation system. This is a standard part of the innovation literature. You must have R&D places. You must have firms which can do it. You must have a critical number of scientists and engineers and others. But there is one important point that we need to stress. There are two really major players in the innovation process. One is firms. Firms carry out a lot of innovation. Tata, for instance, innovates and come out with the Nano. But the other is the government. Government is very important in supporting these moves. The U.S. government has been the biggest supporter of the technologies which are now being commercialized. For instance, many of Apple's technologies really came out of its contracts with the Department of Defense. The search engine that we all call Google, which is the heart of Google, was developed in a contract with the National Science Foundation. These were all public monies which were used to start these very risky kind of innovation systems, which then were commercialized. So without a government support of this, and which is now being, really a lot of being the World Bank type of criticism that no, the government should not pick winners. That is the government's job only to set up a overall ecosystem where innovation can take place, but it should not pick winners. But we find that actually the most important technologies developed have been by the government picking winners, and that is like the Internet. As you know, the Internet was really developed by the U.S. Department of Defense for its own internal communication purposes. So if you did not have that huge subsidy of the basic technological development, you could not have had the type of the innovation of products which has come after these subsidies have been done. Now here we see a difference here between India and China. So I want to bring China into this, well, at least very briefly into this discussion. Indian government does support, for instance, things like renewable energy, etc. But it is nowhere near the amount of support that the Chinese government gives for these areas. The Chinese government has clearly decided that there are 2 or 3 critical technologies which are going to determine the world. They have a strong area. One is nanotechnology, and the other is renewable energies. Up to 2009, you'd be surprised to note that India was really ahead of China in renewable energy technologies and wind technology, etc. But in the last 3-4 years, they've gone way beyond India. I mean, Suzlon is still the biggest Indian company in this, but the Chinese company Goldwind, I think that's what it's called. And overall, China is now a much bigger player in the renewable energy technology, both in the wind technology and also in solar technology. So that support and that consistent support is much stronger there. And so you need, but on the other side, what we do see in India, where India has an advantage over China, is that the Indian innovating firms are very much more innovative. They have a long history of innovation, and Tata, Mahindra, I was very surprised to read this morning about the Mahindra that they have actually designed a tractor for women. I didn't know this. When I was looking up, I was just reading something and preparing today, and I came across this tractor for women. So what have they done? They realized, why did they come up with this tractor for women? Because of the high level of male migration. Men are living out, in Bihar, for instance, about 70% of all rural families have at least one male working outside the village, outside the state. So, obviously there's been a feminization of agriculture, but what do you do? With the tractors that now exist are very difficult for women to operate. One is they require very high level of strength to manage the gears and all of these things which they have. So they put power steering into it so that it's easier to manage. And secondly, they redesigned the foot pedals, because rural women largely wear saris and you can't put the pedals in the middle of the system, so they put it to one side so that a woman wearing a sari can operate the tractor. So this is a minor innovation, but it will help them to be able to reach that market, and they are already training large numbers of women to use these tractors to be tractor drivers. Other systems like that are being done, large number of them. So Indian firms are very innovative, and that's where the advantage is. But it requires that big push, that big support by the government, if this is true, particularly in the major energy-based technologies, which require very basic types of innovations, very basic types of development. It's not just a simple matter of changing a product, but actually making a new product, which is a much more basic innovation system. China is not only the government support far ahead of India, but we also have to admit that China's university and research system is also far ahead of India. I mean, I don't think any Indian university ranks in the top 100 universities in the world. But there must be 5 to 10 Chinese universities that rank in that top 100. The number of scientific publications is much higher in China. The number of patents is higher. But there's one interesting thing. The number of patents by persons of Indian origin is actually very high. Because many of those patents that come out of the USA are of people of Indian origin. So that's very high. That's even higher than those of Chinese origin. But in China itself, there are a much higher number of patents. Not that the Chinese companies don't innovate. The Chinese company, the 2 Chinese companies that make telecom equipment, I'm forgetting the names of these 2. Huawei and ZTE. Thank you. ZTE and Huawei. They are now within the top 3 companies with patent applications. They have overtaken all of the others. There's a Japanese company in between them. Maybe I forget which one. But anyway, they are now in the top 3 of world companies with applications. With patent applications. So they are also way ahead of that, very much ahead. Now, so I would just like to emphasize and come back to the point I made, that there are two questions which I started with. How do we get out of the middle income situation, which we will soon reach once we have completed, exhausted the catch-up possibilities which are leading to productivity improvements, and we now have to have new systems of production to increase productivity and therefore increase per capita income. And that requires innovation in products, and also innovation in basic technologies. How will this give you higher income? Because innovation allows you to capture rent. So we call it either rent or super profits. Innovations allow you to capture. So long as you keep that monopoly position, you can capture that rent. But once you lose that position, then the rents get dissipated and you come back to a level of competitive profit. Why is the USA able to keep this lead? Because they have companies like Apple, which, the per employee earnings of Apple is higher than that of any other company in the USA, even higher than the oil companies. You can imagine how high it is. But how did they do that? Because they only concentrate on design and design and marketing. All the manufacturing is done in Asia. So if that remains so, then Asia will remain only the factory of the world and will not go beyond that. But if we have to go beyond factory Asia, we'll have to move into creating products, design, and branding and marketing. Only with that will we be able to get the high rents or the high profits that go beyond the competitive profits. Secondly, this is also important because particularly in the new technologies, the generic technologies of energy production and of the ICT, which is going to be linked with that in so many ways, because this is the technology that is going to be the critical one to change the world economy in this century for sure. So if Asia is to break out of the middle income trap, by the way, of course, besides Japan, there is one Asian country which has broken out of this middle income trap, and that is Korea. They also were exactly in that position at the time of the last Asian crisis in the late 90s. They had reached the kind of end of that catch-up phase, and now that was the crisis. But after that, their companies have not come up, whether it is Samsung or Hyundai or LG, they have all come up with the innovations which have made them world leaders. So they did break out of that catch-up and move into innovation. So this will have to be duplicated or replicated across Asia. And as this happens, there will also be another beneficial effect because wages will go up in India, and they're already going up. They have gone up very high in China. So countries like China and India will cease to be competitive in the low-end, labor-intensive products. These jobs, like the assembly of electronics or India has not even got them as yet, but already they're moving out of China, but they're not moving to India, they're moving to Bangladesh or to Cambodia or Indonesia and even to Africa. So as these countries go up, the lower level jobs will move to other countries. They will not retain all of that. It happened first with Japan, which shed the bottom end, and then Korea came in, Korea, Taiwan, etc., and then they also shed the bottom end. And now China is doing the same. They're also moving up. The Chinese have a three, in their usual style, they have a 3-go policy. That is, go west, in the west of China, where the wages are lower, go out, where, countries like Southeast Asia, where wages are even lower, and go up. That means go up the value chain, go into high value or high value capturing segments of production, don't remain in the low value segment. So this movement will change, is changing, and there is a movement away from China towards these other countries. So if we were to see this development in terms of the basic technology, yes, we could have an Asian century, but will we also see the kind of conflict which we saw in the European century? The conflict between the major European powers? Will that also be replicated between the major Asian powers if there were to be an Asian century? I will end with this. Thank you.